Hey everyone. So, the last few weeks at church, we've been talking about Mark chapter 6 through Mark chapter 8, and we're seeing the ways that Jesus' ministry is expanding. And he starts out with the Jewish people, and we remember in Mark chapter 6, the apostles had just been sent out, and they're coming back to Jesus to tell him all their stories and all the things that had happened. And so, they fed those 5,000 people instead of getting rest. And so Jesus was strictly feeding Jewish people, because we know the word for basket that they used for all the leftovers. There was 12 baskets of leftovers. And the word for basket was definitely like the word for the Jewish word for a Jewish basket, a basket that the Jewish people made that was different than the baskets that Gentiles used. So it was a certain type of basket. And so the reason that Mark expresses and explains the leftover situation is at least partially, if not mostly, so that the people realize that it's Jewish, that's the Jewish people that Jesus is still in ministry with and feeding. And then in chapter 7, what we talked about last week was that the Syrophoenician woman helped Jesus understand that his ministry was bigger than just for the Jewish people. It's now also for the Gentiles. So Jesus is realizing that this is much bigger than what I think he even realized. So Jesus is now moving into this other kind of ministry that's for everybody, not just for the Jewish people anymore. And this huge transition is taking place through chapter 6 of Mark through chapter 8 of Mark, is Jesus' expansion of his ministry. And so today our scripture comes from Mark chapter 8, and we're going to read another story that parallels that chapter 6 feeding story. But this time, Jesus is going to feed Gentile people. So it's very kind of controversial. So, well, not really controversial, but just for the Jewish people, right? Like, they thought Jesus was there for them. Now he's doing, feeding more peoples and being in ministry to people that aren't Jewish. So Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 1, I'm going to read verses 1 through 10 here. During those days, another large crowd gathered, and since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "7," they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got onto a boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. There it is. So we have a very parallel story, right, to the feeding of the 5,000 people. The same basic things kind of happen. The people have nothing to eat, and so Jesus has compassion for them and feeds them. But the way that Jesus talks, even, we know this is to the Gentiles. And so whenever we hear Jesus say in verse 2, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat." Jesus' following is getting bigger and more expansive. So now he's doing ministry with and for different kinds of people, right? And more diverse people that are not like him. And I think that's very important in this story. And so Jesus has compassion on them, and we see that the Gentiles have been following Jesus now for a few days. And so he's preaching to even a new group of people. But the way the story is told in Mark, this isn't clear yet. And so we have to look at Mark's storytelling. Mark tells this story in chapter 6. Then we have this event happened with a Syrophoenician woman. And then Mark tells the same kind of story with a little bit of differences, right? The story is a little bit different, but he really shows them in parallel fashions. And he shows, okay, Jesus was doing this now for these people, and now Jesus is doing this for these people. Same thing, different people. And that's not going to come into light until the end of the story, right, where they talk about the baskets. So as this is being read, originally to the original people that were hearing this, the original audience, they would know that the first group of people was Jewish. They may assume that this group of people is Jewish as well, or at least recognize the story because it's just 2 chapters before, and so they see these parallels. And then Mark shows them, hey, now this is not who you think it is. And Jesus is not just doing ministry or feeding people and having compassion for people that are like him. He is having compassion and doing ministry with people that are not like him. And that's very, very important in our church right now. So Jesus says in verse 3, if I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. So, right, we have people from all over that are here listening to Jesus, following Jesus, and they see, and we see the diversity, the great diversity in that. And so, again, the disciples ask, where in this remote place can anyone get bread to feed them? And this really starts with the bread, right? Jesus asked the disciples, how many loaves do you have? And they have 7 loaves. And it's the same amount of loaves that was in the previous story. And then Jesus tells the crowd to sit down on the ground, which is exactly what he did in the first story. And we had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them, gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. I want you to realize how similar this wording is to our communion liturgy, right? So this idea of feeding these people, these Gentiles, these people that are different from Jesus is really in our communion liturgy that we talk about and say every time we take communion. So it says he broke them, right? When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he gives thanks, just like in our communion liturgy. He broke them and gave them to his disciples. So Jesus does this also at the Passover. And as he gives them to the disciples, now the disciples' job is to distribute that bread to the people that are gathered. So it says the people were ate and were satisfied. Verse 7. They had a few small fish as well, and he gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. So now they're distributing the bread and the fish, and the people ate and were satisfied, just like in the original story. And then, to me, the punchline probably comes in here as Mark is telling this story, or the original storytellers were telling this story. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that are left over. And so you have the 12, right? The 12 baskets of broken pieces that are Jewish baskets. And 12 means, right, the 12 tribes, the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples. And the number 12 really means this completeness, right? Because we have the complete tribes is 12. And so the number 12 means completeness. And so that first story is about them having enough left over to be complete, right? Enough for everybody. And you can read in some of those messages into that scripture, is that there's enough left over that's complete, enough for everybody. And so in this story, there's 7 baskets. And remember, the word basket is how you know the group of people that Jesus is speaking with and doing ministry with. The word basket here is a Gentile word for basket. And so it's kind of the punchline where the people are like, oh man, now Jesus is talking to a completely different group of people than he was just 2 chapters before. And so this story and this feeding the 4,000 people is showing Jesus' ministry to a new group of people, to an expanded group of people. He doesn't leave the Jewish people aside, but he now is doing ministry to everybody and with everybody. And I think that's a very important lesson that we can take from this as Christians, as the church, is are we doing ministry to people that are like us, or are we doing ministry with people, for people that are not like us? People that we maybe can't relate to, people maybe we can't understand very well, but that can teach us something about themselves and teach us something about where they came from and their experiences. And we can learn from people that are very diverse and not like us. And so I hope as we go about this week, we can meet some new people and think about ministry in a way that is for people not just that are like us, but for people that are not like us. Sorry I couldn't be with you in person today, but I appreciate all of you, and I will see you again next week. Thank you very much.